I remember that morning well. It didn't begin with anxiety, no, but with silence. Such a silence that you could hear the old clock in the kitchen ticking off the seconds tick-tock, and every sound seemed to ask, "Are you still here?" I sat by the window. A cup of cold tea stood beside me. My hands rested on my knees, and I wasn't in a hurry to lift them. At my age, movements don't like haste, they resent it. Outside the window was the courtyard, the very one where I had lived for more than 40 years. The maple tree by the entrance had grown shorter, or perhaps I had grown taller in my memories. The bench where my husband and I used to sit in the evenings was peeling, like an old memory that no one had touched for a long time. I watched and felt something quietly aching inside. Not pain, rather, a weariness from a long life in which there had been too many musts and almost no wants. A weariness that doesn't scream, but simply breathes somewhere beneath my heart, reminding me of itself with every breath. The phone rang sharply. I flinched. My heart, that foolish old heart, always thinks that a phone call brings bad news. The screen lit up with my daughter's name, and I already knew what the conversation would be about. These conversations are rarely different. "Mom." Her voice was quick, collected, as if she had already decided everything for me. "Are you free today? We urgently need you to babysit the children." I was silent, and in that silence, I suddenly heard myself. How long had it been since I had truly heard myself? Not the woman who should, who is obligated, who helps, who saves, but simply myself, an elderly, tired, living woman. "Mom," she repeated, a little more irritably. "You're home anyway. You're home anyway." These words fell heavily, as if my home was simply a place of waiting. It was as if my life was just a pause between other people's affairs. As if my morning, my tea, my gaze out the window meant nothing. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, the past rose before me. I remembered running after work to pick her up from kindergarten, standing by her bed at night when she was sick, and then standing by my grandchildren's beds in the same way, afraid to move so as not to wake them. I remembered saying, "Of course, yes, I can," even when my legs were giving way and my back ached so much I wanted to cry into my pillow. "Mom, do you hear me?" Her voice became colder, and then something inside me quietly clicked. Not broken, no. Rather, it fell into place. I suddenly understood that if I said yes again, another piece of me would simply disappear, without a cry, without a trace. "No," I said quietly. "Today, I can't." A pause hung on the other end of the line, just as heavy as the silence in the kitchen before the call. I could hear her breathing and my own. "What do you mean you can't?" she finally said. "Mom, these are the children." I looked at my hands, wrinkled, thin, both strange and familiar at the same time. These hands had held someone all their lives, supported, pulled. And suddenly I understood how tired they were. "I'm just tired," I said. "Today I need to be alone." She didn't answer immediately. Then she said briefly, "I understand." But I knew she didn't understand. Not then. The call ended. I sat for a long time without moving. The apartment was unusually quiet, and in that silence, something unsettling suddenly arose, as if I had done something wrong. It was as if I had broken an unspoken agreement, according to which an elderly mother is obligated to always be there, always ready, always without a life of her own. I became frightened. Not of loneliness, I was used to that, but of the thought that now they might stop calling me, stop needing me, stop remembering me. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. I stood up slowly, holding onto the table. I went to the mirror in the hallway and looked at myself. A woman with tired eyes looked back at me, very old and very much alive. There was something new in those eyes. Anxiety, yes, but also something else. Tiny, almost imperceptible, like the first spark in a cold stove. I didn't know then that this refusal, quiet, awkward, said almost in a whisper, would be the beginning. Not the end, but something else. Something I wasn't ready for, and something that would forever change my life. After that phone call, the day seemed to stretch out, becoming thick and viscous, like old honey. I walked around the apartment slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance that had suddenly arisen within me. The things around me were painfully familiar. The wardrobe with a peeling handle, the carpet that had survived several fashion trends, the photographs on the wall. But on this day, they looked at me differently. Or perhaps I was looking at them differently. I put the kettle on, even though I didn't want to drink anything. I just needed to occupy my hands. In the silence, thoughts are too easily heard, and my thoughts weren't used to freedom. They had always marched in formation. What to cook, who to call, who to warn, where to be on time. And now, silence. And an empty space into which they didn't know how to fit. I sat down at the table and suddenly caught myself with this strange feeling. Nobody was waiting for me today. Nobody would arrive with bags, with children's cries, with quick steps and weariness in their voice. Nobody would say, "Mom, help me out," as if it wasn't a request, but a part of my name. This thought made me feel both light and pained. The lightness frightened me. At my age, lightness always seems suspicious, as if it will inevitably be followed by retribution. I looked at the clock. At this time, I was usually already getting ready, checking if I had taken my medication, putting cookies for my grandchildren in my bag, putting on my coat. My body remembered this routine. My legs wanted to walk. My hands wanted to grab. But my mind was silent. And in this silence, a question suddenly arose, simple and terrifying. What if I'm no longer needed? I tried to brush it away, like a persistent fly, but it returned. It settled somewhere inside, near my heart, and wouldn't leave. I remembered how, after my husband's death, people gradually stopped calling. First often, then less often, then only on holidays. Loneliness doesn't come all at once. It creeps up politely, almost gently. And one day you realize you're talking to a teapot and thanking it for not whistling too loudly. I went to the window. Children were playing in the yard. Strangers. I watched them for a long time, catching myself looking for familiar movements, familiar faces. I didn't find any. And suddenly I felt a strange jealousy, not towards the children, but towards their grandmothers. Towards those who are needed, important, indispensable right now. This thought stung me with shame. All my life I had tried to be needed, and now I myself was afraid of the moment when I allowed myself not to be. Closer to evening, there was a knock at the door. Quiet, hesitant. I flinched. My heart tightened. What if it was them? What if they had changed their minds? I went to open the door, feeling my legs giving way. But it was my neighbor, Anna Petrovna. She was about 10 years younger than me, but she had long lived with an expression on her face, as if the world had slightly offended her. "I saw the light," she said. "I thought maybe you're not feeling well." I invited her in. We sat in the kitchen, and she talked for a long time about her blood pressure, about her son who rarely calls, about how difficult it had become to climb the stairs. I listened and suddenly realized that I heard a reflection of myself in her words. Only she spoke about it aloud, and I hid it. "You're somehow different today," she suddenly said, looking at me attentively. Quiet. I wanted to brush it off, say I was tired. But instead, I told her about the phone call, about the refusal, about the fear. The words came out slowly, with pauses, as if they were choosing whether or not to appear. Anna Petrovna listened without interrupting, and then she sighed. "You know," she said, "I once said no too. I cried for a week afterward, and then it got easier." Her words didn't bring immediate relief, but they settled deep inside me, like a seed that isn't visible yet, but it's already there. When she left, I was alone. Night fell imperceptibly. I lay in bed and couldn't fall asleep for a long time. In the darkness, my thoughts grew louder. I thought about my daughter. I imagined how irritated she was right now, how she was discussing me with her husband, how she was saying, "Mama's completely given up." That thought hurt the most. Being weak is scary, but being unwanted is even scarier. And yet, deep inside, a strange feeling lingered. Not joy, no, rather anticipation. As if I were standing on the threshold of a room I had never entered before. It was dark, and I didn't know what was inside, but the door was already slightly ajar. And closing it would mean returning to the familiar confines of my life. In the morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was shining through the curtains, and in that light, the dust seemed golden. I lay there and listened to the house waking up, the humming of the pipes, the slamming of the door in the stairwell. And suddenly I understood. The world hadn't collapsed. No one had died because of my refusal. The day had still arrived. I got up, slowly got dressed, and suddenly decided to leave the house without a purpose. Just like that. This decision was small, almost ridiculous, but for me, enormous. I put on my coat, closed the door, and went out. Not to the children. Not on an errand, but simply forward. I didn't know then that this step, so hesitant, so cautious, would be a continuation of that first no, and that ahead of me awaited not only loneliness, but also an encounter with myself, my true self, the one I had almost forgotten. I walked slowly, very slowly. The asphalt under my feet was familiar down to every crack, but that day it felt strange, as if I had stepped into a city where I hadn't lived for a long time. The air was cool and fresh, smelling of wet leaves and distant smoke. Autumn always arrives imperceptibly, first in the air, then in the body. My knees reminded me of themselves with every step, but I didn't stop. Suddenly, it became important for me to get somewhere, it didn't matter where. Just to walk. I caught myself not thinking about time. Usually, it was always sitting beside me, like a strict guard. "Hurry up, don't be late. It's time to go back." But now it was as if it didn't exist. My watch was at home. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself not to know what time it was, and that frightened me almost as much as it pleased me. At the corner I stopped. Before me was a park. Small, old, with peeling benches and crooked paths. I had walked past it hundreds of times, hurrying, looking at my feet, thinking about my own things. But today my feet turned there on their own, as if someone inside me knew the way better than I did. I sat down on a bench. The boards were cold, and I shivered. People were sitting around just like me, elderly people. Some were feeding pigeons, some were staring into space, some were quietly talking to themselves. I suddenly felt a strange kinship with them. We were similar not outwardly, inwardly. We were all waiting for something, or had already stopped waiting. A man sat down next to me. I didn't notice him right away. He was tall, thin, in an old coat neatly buttoned all the way up to his throat. He held a book in his hands, but wasn't reading it. He was just holding it, as if it gave him the right to sit there and not be out of place. "It's cold today," he said quietly without looking at me. I nodded. His voice was calm, even, without any fuss. It was the kind of voice people have who have been silent a lot in their lives. "Autumn," I replied after a pause. "It's always so honest." He smiled slightly. The smile was tired, but warm. We fell silent, and there was no awkwardness in that silence. I suddenly realized how rarely lately people have been truly silent with me, without expectations, without demands, without requests. "Do you come here often?" he asked after a while. "No," I said honestly. "Today? I just came out for the first time." He looked at me more closely. There was no curiosity in his gaze, only understanding. This surprised me. Usually people either don't look at all or they look as if they're judging. "Sometimes that's the hardest thing," he said. "Just to go out." I didn't know what to say, because he was telling the truth. I remembered how for years I only went out on business, as if life was a long list of errands and I was the executor. And now I was sitting here without a task, without a role. We talked a little more about the weather, about the park, about how there used to be music playing here on weekends. He said his name was Sergey, that he lived alone, that his wife had died a long time ago, and his children had moved away. He spoke calmly, without complaint, as if he had resigned himself, but not completely. "And you?" he asked. I hesitated. "How do you talk about yourself when you've spent your whole life talking only about others?" "I have a daughter, grandchildren," I said. "But today, I decided to be alone." He nodded, and again, that understanding. It warmed me more than the sun. When we parted ways, I felt a slight fatigue. But it was a good fatigue, the kind that comes after an honest day. At home, I took off my coat and hung it neatly, as if I knew I would wear it again tomorrow. This thought suddenly seemed important to me. The phone was silent. I caught myself looking at it several times. My heart ached each time. I was waiting for a call from my daughter, with reproach, with coldness, with resentment. But it didn't come, and this silence turned out to be heavier than words. It made me doubt myself. What if I really did something wrong? Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. In the evening I took out an old album, the one I hadn't opened in a long time. The photographs were yellowed, the edges curled. I looked at myself when I was young, then older, then with a child in my arms. And suddenly I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In many of the photographs, I wasn't looking at the camera, but somewhere to the side, as if I was always waiting for something else. At night I dreamed of a park, a bench, autumn, and the feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke up with this feeling and lay there for a long time, without moving, afraid to lose it. The phone rang in the morning. I flinched. My heart sank. It was my daughter. "Mom," she said in a different voice, quieter. "How are you?" I hesitated. I wanted to say fine, as always, but suddenly I went for a walk yesterday, I said. Just a walk. There was a pause on the other end. I'm glad, she finally said, and there was something genuine in those words. Not an obligation, not a formality. We didn't talk for long, but after the conversation, I felt better, as if a thin thread had appeared between us, not taut, not breaking, just a thread. I went out of the house again in the afternoon, and I caught myself waiting, not for a call, not for a request, but for an encounter with the park, with the silence, with myself. I didn't know yet that there would be fears, doubts, and steps backward ahead. But at that moment, I clearly felt something inside me had awakened. Not loudly, not abruptly, but like an old house waking up, with a quiet creak, with long pauses, but it was waking up. I started going out every day, not because I decided to change something, but because my body itself was pulling me towards the door. It was as if a memory of movement, of the right to walk without explanation, had awakened within me. I put on my coat, slowly buttoned it up, checked if the stove was off. Old habits don't disappear immediately, and went out. Sometimes to the park. Sometimes just along the streets where I used to hurry without lifting my eyes. The city was different. It was still the same, the houses, the bus stops, the shops, but now it was looking at me. I caught people's glances, heard snippets of conversations, smelled the scents. Before, all this passed by like background noise. But now, it was as if someone had turned up the volume of life. In the park, I met Sergey again. He was sitting on the same bench, with the same book, and for a second, I thought it was a dream. But he looked up, recognized me, and smiled. This smile was simple, without promises, and that's why it made me feel warm. "You're here again," he said. "Yes," I replied. "It seems I like it here." We walked slowly, almost without talking. Sometimes words aren't necessary, especially at our age. They only get in the way of hearing what's important. I felt a sense of calm next to him. Not joy, not exhilaration, but a rare feeling of not needing to be strong, needed, or right. You could just be. He told me that he used to teach history, that he loved telling his students not about dates, but about destinies. I listened and realized that I hadn't listened to anyone so attentively in a long time. Usually I listened to help, to answer, to solve. But now I simply listened. One day I didn't go for a walk. I stayed home, and suddenly I felt the emptiness rising again. I walked around the apartment, rearranging things, opening cupboards, closing them. Everything inside me was tightening. I understood. Silence can be different. There's the silence of peace, and there's the silence of loneliness, and they're easily confused. The phone was silent again. I caught myself feeling hurt, a silly, childish hurt. After all, I myself wanted to be alone, and now I was waiting for a call. This realization was unpleasant. Freedom, it turns out, also requires courage. Not only to take a step forward, but also to endure its consequences. In the evening, I decided to call my daughter myself. My hands were trembling. I was afraid to hear coldness in her voice. But she answered almost immediately. "Mom," she said, "I wanted to call you. I just didn't know how." We talked for a long time. Not about children. Not about problems. About life. For the first time, she asked me how I felt. Not formally, genuinely. I didn't say I was happy, but I said that I was learning to listen to myself. She was silent, and then quietly said, "Probably. I never thought you needed that." After the conversation, I felt sad. Not from resentment, but from understanding. We often don't think about what our parents feel. We think of them as simply being there, like furniture, like walls. And then suddenly one day they say no, and that's frightening. The next day I went to the park again. Sergey was waiting. I didn't ask why he came at that particular time. And he didn't ask me. It was an unspoken agreement. We talked about trifles, about books, about how the taste of tea changes with age, about how sometimes the past seems closer than the present. One day he said, "You know, you've changed." I became wary. "Is that bad?" "No," he smiled. "It's noticeable." I thought about those words for a long time. In the evening, lying in bed, I replayed the last few weeks in my mind. Rejection, fear, walks, conversations. And suddenly I understood. I had started to feel not just fatigue, but also interest. Quiet, cautious, like a sprout under the snow. But along with this came anxiety. What if all this is temporary? What if I find myself alone again, but without my former support? We, the elderly, are afraid of change not because we don't want something new, but because the new can leave, and we don't have the strength to survive that anymore. That night, I dreamed of my husband. He was sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea, and looking at me with that same smile, warm, calm. "You're finally living," he said. I woke up in tears. In the morning I sat by the window for a long time, and suddenly I understood. Life doesn't return loudly. It doesn't knock on the door. It comes quietly when you stop calling for it. I didn't yet know where these walks, these conversations, this new feeling inside would lead. But I knew one thing. I couldn't go back to that life where I was just a function, even if I wanted to. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and doubts, a hope flickered. Very fragile, but alive. I found myself increasingly looking forward to the mornings. Not because something important was ahead, but because the day itself had ceased to be empty. This anticipation was quiet, almost shameful. At my age, it's not customary to expect anything new from life. We learn to endure, to accept, to be grateful for what remains. And yet I suddenly was waiting. Sergey entered my life so imperceptibly that I didn't immediately realize how deeply he had taken root in it. He didn't call. He didn't come without warning. We simply met. In the park, at that very bench. Sometimes he was there, sometimes not. And that was right. Nothing superfluous. No dependence. At least, that's what I thought. One day, he wasn't there for 2 days in a row. I came, sat down, waited. Then again. My heart ached with a strange feeling, not anxiety, no. More like disappointment. As if I had allowed myself too much again. As if I had believed again that I could not be alone. On the third day, I didn't go to the park. I stayed home. The apartment felt cramped. The walls seemed to close in. I suddenly remembered how I used to wait for my husband to come home from work. How I listened for footsteps on the stairs. Back then, the waiting was full of meaning. And now, emptiness. That evening, the doorbell rang. I flinched. Not the phone, the door. It was unexpected. I opened it and saw Sergey. He stood awkwardly, holding a small bag. "I thought, maybe you were worried," he said. I was a little unwell. I felt both relieved and ashamed. Relieved because he was alive, here, and ashamed because I had allowed myself to wait, to be afraid, to become attached. We drank tea in the kitchen, my teapot, my mugs, my silence, and suddenly another person appeared in it. It was strange, almost frightening. I hadn't let anyone get this close in a long time, not physically, but emotionally. He talked about his life, about how, after his wife's death, he couldn't bring himself to go into that same kitchen for a long time. How he removed everything that reminded him of her, and then realized that he had also removed a part of himself. I listened and felt something resonate within me. We were different, but our pain was similar. I don't want to disappear again, he suddenly said. Not from anyone's life. Not even from my own. These words hung between us. I didn't know what to say, because the same thought lived within me, only I was afraid to admit it. After he left, I couldn't sleep for a long time. His words, his voice, his presence kept swirling in my head. I understood. I was standing at a crossroads. Either I would close myself off again for the sake of peace, or I would take a risk for the sake of life. The next day, my daughter called. Her voice was tense. Mom, we have a problem. The children are sick. We really need your help. I was silent. My heart ached. This was a moment of truth. Not because I didn't want to help, but because I was afraid of losing what I had only just begun to find. I can come, I finally said, but not every day, and not for long. She was silent. Then she quietly said, I understand. This I understand was new, unfamiliar. It meant that I had been heard, not immediately, but heard nonetheless. I went to see my grandchildren. They hugged me, clung to me, like before. I felt warmth, real warmth. And suddenly I understood, love doesn't disappear if you set boundaries. It simply changes. Walking home, I went slowly. Inside, I felt calm. I hadn't betrayed myself. And I hadn't turned away from my family. I had found a middle ground, and that's the hardest thing. In the evening, I went to the park again. Sergei was sitting on a bench. I sat down next to him. We were silent for a long time, and in that silence there were more words than in any conversation. I'm afraid, I said suddenly. I'm afraid that if I allow myself this, it will hurt later. He looked at me intently. It will hurt in any case, he said. The only question is, from what? I thought about it, and I understood the pain of emptiness is worse than the pain of loss, because emptiness is endless. When I returned home, I looked at myself in the mirror. The same woman, the same wrinkles, but the gaze was different. There was acceptance of life in it. Not ecstasy, not joy, but a quiet yes. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of this uncertainty, because I felt alive again. Life doesn't change immediately. It's like an old river. It carries you along its familiar course for a long time, even when you've already turned in a different direction. I didn't understand this right away. On the outside, everything remained almost the same courtyard, the same entrance, the same morning pains in my knees. But inside, something was slowly, cautiously rearranging itself. I stopped making excuses. It happened imperceptibly. Before, every "I can't" was accompanied by explanations, apologies, anxiety. But now I simply told the truth. Sometimes briefly, sometimes quietly. And the world didn't collapse. People were surprised, sometimes offended, sometimes they fell silent. But life went on. My relationship with my daughter changed. Not easier, more honest. She started calling not only when she needed something. Sometimes she just asked how my day went. I learned to answer not routinely, but genuinely. It was difficult. In my generation, we weren't taught to talk about ourselves. We were taught to endure. Sergey became part of my rhythm. Not the center, I wouldn't allow myself that. But nearby. We didn't see each other every day. Sometimes I refused a meeting if I felt tired. And he accepted it. There was respect in that, rare, almost forgotten. One day, he suggested we go to the theater. I was taken aback. The theater, that word sounded like something from another life. From the one where I was younger, bolder, where there was a later ahead. I wanted to refuse. But then, I agreed. We sat next to each other, not touching. On stage, they talked about love, about time, about loss. And suddenly I felt a tear rolling down my cheek. Not from sadness, from recognition. As if someone had said aloud what I had carried within me for years. After the performance, we walked in silence for a long time. At my house, he stopped. "I don't expect anything from you," he said. "I just wanted you to know. I feel good when I'm with you." These words weren't demanding. They didn't require an answer. They were a gift. And I accepted it, allowing myself to accept something for the first time in a long time. But with that came fear. What if all this is the last light before the darkness? We, the elderly, are afraid of joy, because we know the price of loss, because we understand time is short, and every step forward is a risk. During that period, I often thought about death, not morbidly, calmly, the way one thinks about something inevitable. I was reviewing papers, tidying up closets, and suddenly I caught myself thinking a strange thought. I'm no longer afraid to leave because I'm living again. One evening I felt unwell. High blood pressure. Weakness. I sat down on the bed and couldn't get up for a long time. My phone was lying nearby. I looked at it and wondered, who should I call? Before, I would have called my daughter. Now, I dialed Sergey's number. He arrived quickly. He fussed, heated water, spoke softly. I looked at him and felt not gratitude, but trust. That was new. "You don't have to be strong," he said. Never. These words touched something very deep within me. I suddenly realized how many years I had spent proving that I could, but I could have simply been. After that evening, I changed even more. Not outwardly. Inside. I allowed myself to be dependent, not completely, not blindly, but in a human way. And that didn't make me weak. On the contrary, I thought more and more often about that morning when it all began. About that first no. It no longer seemed like selfishness to me. It was an act of salvation. My own salvation. And one day, sitting by the window, I caught myself smiling. Just like that. For no reason. It was raining outside. The clock was ticking. The world was still the same. But I wasn't. I didn't know how much time I had left. But for the first time in a long time, I felt that there was enough time. Because I was finally living my own life. Not someone else's. My own. I often return in my thoughts to that morning. To the cup of cold tea. To the window. To the phone call I answered in a way that wasn't expected of me. Back then, I felt like I was standing on the edge. That one wrong word, and everything would collapse. My family, the familiar order of things, my place in life. At my age, we fear change more than anything, not because we are weak, but because we know too well how painful falling can be. But nothing collapsed. The world didn't punish me for saying no. My daughter didn't turn away. My grandchildren didn't forget me. I wasn't left alone, as I feared. Everything simply changed. Quietly. Almost imperceptibly. That's how the light changes outside the window. At first you don't see the difference, and then you realize that the day is already different. Now my mornings begin differently. I still sit by the window. I still drink tea. The clock still ticks. But inside, there is no longer that emptiness that used to accompany every sound. Now the silence doesn't weigh me down. It warms me. There is a place for me in it. I have learned to listen to my body. If it asks for rest, I give it rest. If it wants to go out, I go out. I no longer explain, justify, or prove anything. I simply live the way I can. And that is enough. Sergey is nearby. Not always. Not every day. But in my life. We don't make plans. We don't say grand words. We simply know that we can call each other. Come over. Be silent together. And at our age, that's the most valuable thing. When you don't have to pretend. Sometimes I think, what if I had said yes back then? What if I had pushed myself aside again? I probably would have managed. I always managed. But managing doesn't mean living. Now, when I look at my hands, I see not only wrinkles. I see a life lived. And there was much love in this life. Sometimes at my own expense. Sometimes too silent. But it was there. And now I've allowed it to be there for me too. My daughter started visiting more often just because, without being asked. We sit in the kitchen, drink tea, talk about different things. Sometimes about the past. Sometimes about fears. She has started to see in me not only a mother, but also a woman. And that, perhaps, is the most unexpected gift. I'm no longer afraid of the word loneliness. It has ceased to sound like a sentence. Loneliness isn't when you're alone. It's when you're absent from your own life. And now I am present. Sometimes I still feel sad. Sometimes I remember my husband and cry. Sometimes I'm afraid of the future. Old age hasn't disappeared. It's still there. But now it's not empty. There is warmth in it. Peace. Acceptance. I don't know how much time I have left. And I've stopped counting. Because every day that you live honestly with yourself is already a gift. A big one. A quiet one. A real one. If I could say something to that woman by the window, the one who is afraid to say no, I would simply tell her, you have the right to fatigue, to silence, to joy, to life. And maybe that's where everything begins with this right.